Multiplayer LAN battles can be quite daunting for any new players who just switch over from campaign because the knowledge and skills are often very different. In this new series, we'll be covering some basic concepts so that new players can have an easier time getting into multiplayer. We'll begin with how to set up a good formation in multiplayer. A good formation deployment is a good start to a battle. In general, there are 3 types of formations: the box, the line, and the checkerboard. These are the most commonly used formations and also the basics in multiplayer. All the other formations are usually some form of variant or a mixture of these 3. In this video, we'll be going into the detail of these formations and some of the variants. Now let us start with the most notorious of all 3, the defensive box formation. There are 2 ways to play this. The first one is to surround your missile troops with your melee troops, essentially forming an enclosed box. Using the melee troops, you can protect your missiles in the middle, holding back enemy units while the missiles can safely sit back and shoot down the enemies. Just like the Minotaurs here being stuck on state troops, while the Huntsmen are peppering them with their anti-launch arrows. The second way to play a box formation is the melee box. Instead of bringing missile troops as your damage dealer, you go for a full melee formation. The purpose is to outlast your opponent with your defensive troops, so the walls of the boxes would be consisting of a bunch of elite troops to hold the line. Usually this kind of box build would be supported by some form of healing to give the box even more durability, and at the same time, due to the lack of DPS from the infantry units, monsters or flyers would be brought with this build as the damage dealers. The great thing about box build is that there is minimal micro required, so even beginners can easily use them well. However, that doesn't mean the formation isn't necessarily good. Box formations are usually very static and passive, meaning that they're giving the control of the battle to their opponent. Despite the defensive advantage of a box build, if their opponent knows how to crack open a box and is prepared to do so, then the box build usually can't do much about it, as their main tactic is to sit there and pray that their box outlasts their opponents. This is the reason why even if box is a rather popular formation on ranked ladder, you don't actually see them that much on high-end plays like in tournaments. Still, it is a very beginner-friendly formation that a lot of newer players would use until they start to get the hang of multiplayer and move on to other more complex formations. The next formation that we'll talk about is the line formation, and as the name suggests, it is fairly straightforward, just a line. Unlike the tightly packed box formation, the line formation tries to go as wide as possible. The idea is to go so wide that you have enough forces to wrap around enemies' formations and perform flanking or rear charging maneuvers. A typical line formation would be something like this, going a far line here, and then you have the forces on the flanks also pushing. Everything is committed to the push and nothing is holding back. Sure, there might be a second line of missiles occasionally, but there is nothing dedicated to their protection. These missiles survive not because there's something protecting them, but because everything is keeping up the pressure on the flanks in the middle that nothing can flank around to hit up these missiles. Once the attacking troops start to break through, they will collapse onto the other parts of their opponent's formations. Another way to play a line formation is to go narrow. Instead of going wide and spread out, you go for a quality approach. For example, stacking monsters on top of your infantry. The main idea is to give your front line a lot more punching power to overload your enemy's front line. When supported with the right buffs and area of effect damage, for example Wolfric's Bolt or Burning Head, the entire front line, which concentrated all the killing power of the army, can have a much better time breaching enemies' defenses, after that going straight for the enemy's back lines. The line formation is usually an all or nothing tactic. You throw everything into combat holding nothing in reserve, trying your best to break through your enemy's defenses. You either make it through or eventually your push loses steam and instead being pushed back by your opponent. It is a fairly straightforward attacking formation, but it does take up a bit more micro than the defensive box. For the third and most common formation in possibly both multiplayer and single player, we have the checkerboard formation. Essentially a multi-layered formation with troops forming multiple lines with decent amount of space between each unit. Similar to the line formation and unlike the box formation, it is more spread out, and unlike the line formation but similar to the box formation, it has multiple layers of troops, usually even dedicated flanks and rear protection. This makes the checkerboard a lot more flexible than the other 2 formations, suitable for both offense and defense. A defensive checkerboard formation would be something like this. We can see a front line of Nobblers screening and tying down enemy, a second line of more Nobbler trappers here providing some skirmishing fire and also acting as a second line of chaff and reserve troops. Now at the back we do have a lot of flank and rear protection. Unlike the box formation, they are not here to seal off the formation to protect the backline, but instead they are acting more as a reactive force to deal with any approaching threats. When the backline isn't pressured, they can even peel off some mobility to handle enemy threats far away. Of course, my opponent is trying to harass my backline with the Harpies, so my defenders here, the Man-Eaters and Saber-Tusks, are reacting to this threat. But if situation demands, they will also push out and join the offense. While this does create more gaps in the checkerboard formation than a box, requiring the player to use more micro to defend it, it does add more tactical flexibility in battle. The checkerboard formation can also go on the offense. For example, the Wood Elves here with a front line of Dryads pushing, reinforced by a second line of War Dancers. Further back, a third line of Glade Guards with Starfire shafts protected by a bunch of mobility. If the Wood Elves' opponents have a narrow build, the Wood Elf light mobility can use their speed to their advantage and strike them from their flanks and rear. But the Dark Elves are pushing forth with a lot of their own mobility, so the Wood Elf cavalry are held in defense. The Wood Elf frontline is beating up Druchii just fine, but they need to make sure the flanks don't collapse so the frontline can do their job. Especially the Glade Guards need to be protected so they can continue to provide some very valuable fire support. Unlike the line formation, a checkerboard does not throw everything into a single rush. Instead, there are multiple components all over the field ready to deal with different threats. Their units can switch roles according to the situation. For example, Wood Elf Cavalry, which are usually used rather aggressively, but now they're sacrificing their lives to hold back the enemies, so the push can continue without being interrupted by a flanking maneuver. A good checkerboard formation can handle most situations. The multi-layer designs allows the reserves to be committed as additional defense forces, reacting to incoming threats and protect the missile backline. Should the need arise, those same reserves can be sent onto the offense, driving away enemies. The use of reserve troops and mobility that are not fully committed to a static defense or an all-out attack adds a lot of flexibility to the formation, allowing the player to switch between different playstyles as the situation demands. Outside of the three basic formations, players have came up with a lot of other variants. I'll briefly cover some of them so that you can try them out yourselves. Here we have our first example, the flank overload. Similar to the line formation, it is a rush formation, but unlike the evenly spread out line, it concentrates the heavy hitters onto one flank. The idea is to create a breach in your opponent's formation and then collapse onto the rest of their army. Just like here, we have the Norskin characters plus the Familiar Warriors rushing onto the Chaos Dwarf's left flank. The Chaos Dwarfs tries to respond, but a lot of their resources are committed elsewhere, unable to hold back all my forces, and some of my Warhounds are able to sneak in and get a rear charge. A rather risky tactic as you gamble all your forces onto one single flank. If the push succeeds, then you steamroll the rest of your opponent's army, but if it doesn't, then your whole game plan falls apart. The next formation is the Distraction Carnifex, a term originated from the tabletop game. The whole idea boils down to plopping a massive monster in the middle of your army. Now the tabletop tactic refers more to using the monster to capture your opponent's attention, but in Total Warhammer, this monster would be used for more of a disruption purpose. Because of their mass and survivability, these single entity monsters can often push straight through the front line to get into the fragile backline. After that, the monster can hop between different units, disrupting their missile fire, and sometimes with the healing available, even if they take damage, they can quickly heal back up with their massive HP pool. This is especially effective against box formations because factions that box usually don't have units with enough mass to stop giant monsters from running them over. Now, if you're confident enough with your own micro, then perhaps you don't need a formation at all. There's no definite front line or back line for the formation, and instead your entire army with their mobility advantage circles around your opponent's formations, picking apart their defenses by hit and runs. This forces your opponent to react with their forces, exposing weaknesses in their formation which you can then exploit. This tactic is usually done with an overwhelming force of cavalry and perhaps sometimes mixed in with skirmishers. It is a very micro-intensive playstyle as you need to maintain good control over all of your cavalry at all times. They cannot afford to get stuck in melee for too long as they will get dragged down eventually. And that's all the basic formations you need for multiplayer land battles. Of course, these are just some basic ideas and perhaps you can even come up with your own new formation design. I hope you find this guide useful, and if you want to see more Total War Warhammer content, be sure to subscribe to my channel. That's all for today, and I'll see you in the next one. Tactical Lich, signing out.